The old house had always been a curiosity. Clara had lived in it for less than a month when she first noticed the strange, subtle shifts in its atmosphere. The home belonged to her grandmother, a reclusive woman who had passed away the year before, leaving the sprawling, decaying Victorian estate to Clara's family. It was full of forgotten things, relics from another era. Dusty portraits lined the hallways, their painted eyes following her with unnerving intensity, and the scent of mildew clung stubbornly to every corner. It was Halloween night, crisp and silent, with the occasional gust of wind rattling the loose window panes. Clara, with no plans and no desire to spend the evening alone in her room, had taken to wandering the house, exploring the dusty and cobweb corners she had yet to uncover. The most intriguing part of the house was the attic, always locked, as though hiding something more than just boxes of old clothes and forgotten antiques. Curiosity had its way, as it often did. Earlier that day, while searching through her grandmother's things, she had found an old iron key with a ribbon tied around it, its brass surface tarnished with age. Clara was certain it belonged to the attic, and now, as the evening descended into darkness, she held it in her hand, standing at the base of the attic stairs. The air felt colder as she climbed, each step creaking beneath her feet. The door was stubborn, resisting her first attempts to unlock it, but with a sharp turn of the key, it swung open, revealing a space untouched by time. The attic was full of forgotten memories, a chest filled with moth-eaten clothes, a rocking chair draped in dust, and shelves stacked with books that no one had touched in decades. And then, there was the mirror. It was large, standing taller than Clara, with an ornate, silver frame that seemed too new for the age of everything else in the room. The mirror was out of place, its glass impossibly clean amidst the clutter. Something about it drew her in, the way it reflected not just her image but the entire room behind her in unsettling clarity. The stories her grandmother used to tell her about this mirror, a mirror that, according to local legend, appeared only on Halloween nights, began to resurface in her mind. The thought made her shiver. Clara approached it slowly, her own reflection watching her with a curious gaze. The legend was simple: stare into the mirror at exactly midnight, and you would see your future. People spoke of terrifying images, visions of tragedies, terrible fates that awaited those who dared to look. But Clara, a skeptic at heart, had always brushed them off as superstition. Still, the pull of the mirror was undeniable. Glancing at her phone, she saw it was nearly midnight. The night had fallen so quietly around her, the only sound was the faint ticking of a clock from somewhere far below. The minutes passed slowly, the anticipation building with each second. As the final stroke of midnight sounded, Clara stepped directly in front of the mirror, her face only inches from the surface. For a moment, there was nothing unusual, just her own reflection staring back at her, tired and unimpressed. But then, the edges of the glass seemed to ripple, as though something was shifting behind it. Her reflection began to blur and distort, the features warping into something unrecognizable. And then, suddenly, it wasn't her reflection at all. The face staring back at her wasn't hers, it was a version of her, but twisted. Its eyes were hollow, its skin pale and lifeless. The reflection leaned forward, pressing its hands against the glass from the inside, its expression cold and void of any human warmth. Clara stumbled back, her heart pounding as the figure moved closer to the surface, as though trying to push its way through the barrier between them. Then, it smiled. A smile that was not hers, not human, and not of this world. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the thing in the mirror whispered, its voice not heard but felt deep within her bones. "I'm waiting." She turned and ran, the attic door slamming shut behind her as she descended the stairs, her heart racing in terror. But even as she fled, she couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection, the twisted version of herself, had not stayed behind in the attic. It had followed her. Clara sat in the kitchen the next morning, staring blankly at her cold cup of coffee. The bright daylight streaming through the windows did little to shake the chill that had settled deep within her since her encounter with the mirror. Sleep had come in fits and starts, broken by strange dreams of flickering images she couldn't quite piece together. But always, at the center of those dreams, was the smile, the twisted reflection that had met her in the attic, that smile which no amount of morning light could erase. It had been a trick of the mind, she told herself. A Halloween prank her own imagination had played on her. The attic was old, the mirror strange, but surely not some doorway to darker truths. She had allowed the legends to creep too far into her thoughts, and in the midnight quiet, her mind had conjured up something it knew would scare her. She clung to this explanation with a fierce grip, as though the very act of believing it could banish the memory of what she had seen. The house itself seemed to disagree. As Clara moved about her day, she noticed small things that were out of place. At first, it was easy to dismiss them. A book on the table that she didn't remember leaving there, the door to the guest room slightly ajar when she had closed it the night before. But as the day wore on, the disturbances grew harder to explain. Shadows shifted in her peripheral vision, darting just beyond her line of sight. She'd hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, from the hallway, though when she checked, the house remained empty. By late afternoon, the air had taken on a strange heaviness, a stillness that made each creak of the floorboards feel deliberate, almost watchful. She could sense it, as one senses the approach of a storm, the feeling that something was near, waiting just out of sight. Her thoughts kept returning to the attic, to the mirror and its disturbing reflection. A part of her knew she should stay away, leave it locked and forgotten. Yet, an equally strong part of her was drawn back, as though the house itself was urging her to return. At dusk, Clara found herself standing at the foot of the attic stairs once again. The key weighed heavily in her pocket. She had no intention of going back up there, not really. But the pull was undeniable, and before she fully realized what she was doing, her hand was on the banister, her feet moving one step at a time. The air in the attic was colder than the rest of the house, a stark reminder of the previous night. The mirror stood exactly where she had left it, its surface still pristine, still inviting in its unsettling way. For a moment, she almost convinced herself that it had all been a dream, that nothing had changed. But then, she saw it. There, in the reflection, something moved. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in the shadows behind her reflection, but then it grew, taking shape. A figure, faint but undeniably present, stood just behind her in the glass. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge her, but its presence filled the room with a tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Clara turned quickly, her heart in her throat, expecting to see someone standing behind her. But the attic was empty, as silent as it had been moments before. Still, she felt it, that weight of unseen eyes upon her, the sensation that she was not alone. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. Clara backed away slowly, her pulse racing, until she reached the attic door. Slamming it shut behind her, she locked it again, hands trembling as the key turned with a sharp, metallic click. She leaned against the door, trying to calm herself, to breathe. But the air felt thick, oppressive, like the very house was closing in on her. For the next few hours, she tried to distract herself, moving from room to room, keeping lights on wherever she went. But no amount of light could dispel the darkness she felt creeping closer, like it was curling around her, waiting for the right moment. By nightfall, Clara had convinced herself that leaving the house was her only option. She needed air, space, anything to escape the growing unease. As she reached for her coat, she glanced at the hallway mirror, just for a second, but what she saw stopped her cold. There, in the reflection, was that same twisted version of herself. Not in the attic now, but here, in the hallway, watching her with those hollow eyes and that awful, knowing smile. Clara gasped, stepping back, her hand flying to her mouth. The reflection didn't move, didn't react, but the chill it sent down her spine was undeniable. She blinked, once, twice, hoping it would vanish. But it didn't. It stayed there, frozen in the glass, as though waiting for her to acknowledge it. This time, there were no whispers, no eerie voices calling her back to the attic. There was just the reflection, watching, and that terrible smile. Clara turned and fled, not just from the mirror, but from the entire house. The village was quiet as Clara stumbled outside, her breath visible in the cold night air. The streets, though familiar, seemed strangely foreign in the dark, as if the entire world had shifted slightly out of place. The soft glow from the street lamps cast long, distorted shadows on the pavement, and every sound, the rustle of the wind through the trees, the distant bark of a dog, seemed amplified, more sinister somehow. Clara paused at the gate, her heart still racing from what she had seen. Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts as she looked back at the house, its dark windows staring blankly back at her. It had always been an old, creaky place, full of the quirks that came with age, drafts that sneaked through cracks in the walls, floorboards that groaned under the weight of time. But tonight, it felt alive, aware, as though it had been waiting all along for someone like her to awaken it. The urge to flee was overwhelming. She could simply run to the village inn, stay the night, and leave the house behind, let it fade into a strange and unsettling memory. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that easy. Whatever was happening inside that house wasn't something she could outrun. It had already followed her, into the hallway mirror, into the quiet of her thoughts. Turning away from the house felt impossible. She could feel its pull, like a magnet drawing her back. It wanted her to return. The very air seemed to thrum with it. But the thought of stepping back inside made her stomach turn. Instead, she wandered the streets, letting her feet carry her further from the house, though her mind never strayed far from what had happened. She passed closed shops, dark windows with faint glimpses of Halloween decorations still clinging to their frames. Pumpkins sat on stoops, their jagged smiles frozen in the glow of porch lights. But Clara found no comfort in the familiar sights. Even the villagers' homes seemed distant, their warmth unreachable through the cold veil that now separated her from ordinary life. After an hour of aimless walking, she found herself standing outside the village library. Its tall, Gothic windows seemed to loom over her, and for a moment, Clara hesitated. There was something about the building that had always made her uneasy, something too quiet about its stone walls, as if they held too many secrets. But tonight, the library was the only place that called to her. Inside, the dim light cast long shadows across the shelves, and the air smelled of old paper and polished wood. The library was nearly deserted, save for a lone figure at the front desk, a woman in her 60s, her gray hair tied neatly in a bun, her glasses perched at the end of her nose. She looked up as Clara entered, her expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Good evening," the woman said softly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "You're out late." Clara nodded, her voice catching in her throat. I need to look something up." The librarian gestured toward the rows of shelves. "Feel free. We're open for another hour." Clara wandered between the towering shelves, her fingers trailing absently over the spines of books, her mind racing. She didn't know what she was searching for, perhaps some explanation for what was happening to her. She felt drawn to the darker corners of the library, to the sections that held stories of folklore, old superstitions, and legends. Her hand stopped on a worn leather book, its title faded with age. "The Unseen, a Study of Mirrors and Folklore." She pulled it from the shelf, flipping through the brittle pages until her eyes landed on a passage that made her heart skip a beat. There are mirrors, old and forgotten, that have the power to reflect not just the surface of a person, but the essence of their soul. Such mirrors are rare and dangerous, for they hold the ability to show a future not yet written, or worse, a version of the self that has been lost to time, suspended between worlds. Clara's hands trembled as she read on, the words blurring together in her mounting dread. On nights of great spiritual significance, such as All Hallows' Eve, these mirrors become conduits, gateways between the seen and unseen. If one is unlucky enough to gaze into such a mirror at the stroke of midnight, they may see not the reflection they know, but a reflection of their own fate, twisted and dark. Her mind raced back to the attic, to the mirror, to that smile. Had she really seen a vision of her future? Or had she seen something much worse, herself, trapped in some liminal space, neither fully alive nor fully gone? As she closed the book, her reflection in the library window caught her eye. It was nothing more than her own tired face staring back at her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with it, something too still, too distant. Clara hurried out of the library, clutching the book tightly to her chest as though it could somehow protect her. Outside, the air was even colder than before, and the shadows seemed to stretch further than they should. Every step she took felt heavier, each streetlight she passed flickering as though the darkness was closing in. When she finally reached the house again, her breath caught in her throat. The attic window was glowing faintly. She hadn't left the light on. She was sure of it. The house stood before her, waiting. The light in the attic window flickered like a distant star, faint yet undeniable, pulling Clara back toward the house with a force she couldn't resist. She stood at the front gate for what felt like an eternity, the cold night air biting at her skin, her mind replaying the words she had just read in the library. The idea that the mirror was something more than an old family heirloom now settled deep in her bones, a weight she couldn't shake. Steeling herself, Clara pushed open the gate and walked slowly up the path, the crunch of gravel beneath her feet the only sound in the still night. The house loomed over her, its once familiar shape now strange and menacing. Each window seemed to watch her approach, dark eyes set against the pale face of the old house. Inside, the silence was thicker than before, as if the house had been waiting for her return. She hesitated in the entryway, the cold seeping through her shoes. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound almost deafening in the quiet. She had to go back up to the attic. She knew it, even though every fiber of her being screamed against it. But what was waiting for her up there? With trembling hands, Clara gripped the banister and began her slow ascent. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air growing colder the higher she climbed. The old wood of the stairs groaned under her weight, as if protesting her presence. When she reached the top of the stairs, she paused, her breath shallow, her hand frozen on the doorknob to the attic. The faint glow from within still spilled out from under the door, casting a thin line of light across the dark floor. Clara's fingers tightened around the handle. She turned it slowly, the creak of the hinges almost unbearable in the stillness, and pushed the door open. The attic was just as she had left it, dusty, cluttered, its air thick with the smell of time and neglect. But the mirror, it sat in the same spot, facing her directly, its surface glowing faintly with an ethereal light. The room felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks, the air heavy and waiting. Clara stepped inside, her eyes locked on the mirror. She could see herself reflected in its surface, though the glow around her seemed to ripple slightly, distorting her features just enough to make her question what she was seeing. The smile from earlier haunted her, but now her reflection looked serious, almost grave, as if the version of her within the mirror was waiting for her to make a choice. Slowly, she approached the mirror, her footsteps soundless on the old wooden floor. Her reflection moved with her, but something was off. Its movements were a fraction too slow, a beat behind her own. She stopped just a foot away from the glass, and so did her reflection, staring back at her with eyes that seemed darker, deeper than her own. "Who are you?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible in the thick silence. Her reflection didn't respond. It simply stared, unblinking, its gaze intense and unnerving. The glow around the mirror grew brighter for a moment, then dimmed again, as if the light itself were breathing. Clara reached out hesitantly, her fingertips brushing the cold surface of the glass. The moment she touched it, a chill shot up her arm, freezing her in place. The reflection's eyes widened, too wide, unnaturally wide, and its mouth twisted into a smile that wasn't her own. Without warning, her reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the inside of the glass, as if it were trying to push its way through. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled back, her heart racing. The reflection mirrored her movements again, but the smile remained, growing wider, more distorted, its eyes gleaming with something dark and hungry. For a moment, Clara felt as though the mirror were pulling her in, drawing her closer despite the terror coursing through her. She could feel it, some invisible force tugging at her, trying to drag her toward the glass. Her legs felt heavy, rooted to the floor as if she were sinking into it. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the pull stopped. Her reflection stood still once more, its face calm, expressionless, but the damage was done. Clara no longer trusted what she saw in the mirror. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else, something waiting for its moment to escape. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, her eyes never leaving the mirror. As she reached the door, the attic grew darker, the glow from the mirror fading until it was nothing more than an ordinary piece of glass reflecting the dim light of the room. But Clara knew it wasn't ordinary. She had seen too much to believe that. Shaken, she stumbled out of the attic and down the stairs, the heavy weight of the house pressing in on her from all sides. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker, heavier, as if the house itself were alive, breathing in the fear that now gripped her. Back in the kitchen, Clara collapsed into a chair, her mind racing. What had she seen? Was it her future, as the legend claimed? Or had she glimpsed something far darker, a version of herself that had been waiting for the right moment to step through? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The legend had said the mirror was strongest at that hour, that it could reveal not just the future but something far more dangerous if provoked. And now she had provoked it. A sudden knock at the front door shattered the silence, making Clara jump. She sat frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest. No one should be out at this hour, not on Halloween night. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Clara stood slowly, her legs trembling, and made her way to the door. Clara stood before the door, her hand hovering over the cold brass knob, the air around her thick with a suffocating silence. Outside, the knocking had ceased, leaving only the echo of it reverberating through the house. For a moment, she hoped whoever had been there had simply gone away, but deep down, she knew better. The house, the mirror, the cold, creeping dread, it had all led to this. Her fingers closed around the doorknob, icy to the touch, and she turned it slowly. The door creaked open just a crack, enough for her to peer through, her heart racing in her chest. The porch was empty. No one stood in the shadows of the old oak tree. No figures waited in the misty darkness that clung to the front yard. Yet, the sensation of being watched was undeniable, a heavy presence lingering in the air, pressing in on her from all sides. She stepped back from the door, hesitating before closing it softly, trying to convince herself that she had imagined the whole thing. But as the latch clicked shut, another sound reached her ears, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like the faintest breeze brushing against the back of her neck. Clara. Her name. It wasn't the wind. The whisper came from inside the house. Clara spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The hallway was empty, the dim light from the kitchen casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. The house felt as though it had grown darker in the span of a moment, the corners of every room swallowed in shadow. She stood frozen, listening, waiting. And then, from upstairs, the sound of soft footsteps. Someone, or something, was in the house with her. Clara's legs felt heavy, her instincts screaming at her to leave, to run out the front door and never look back. But she was rooted to the spot, her heart pounding in her ears, her mind racing. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, each one echoing through the house like a heartbeat. They were coming from the attic. The mirror. Clara's mind raced back to the attic and the reflection she had seen, distorted, twisted, alive in ways that should not be possible. She remembered how her reflection had tried to push its way through the glass, the feeling of being pulled toward it, as though the mirror wanted her to step inside. And now, it seemed that whatever had been inside the mirror was no longer confined to its glass prison. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent, as they made their way down the stairs. Clara backed away, her pulse quickening. She didn't dare look up the staircase. She didn't want to see what was coming. The house groaned around her, the walls seeming to close in as the air thickened with dread. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, and the whisper came again, soft, but unmistakable. Clara. Her name echoed through the house, sending a cold shiver down her spine. She backed into the kitchen, her eyes darting toward the back door. She could leave, run into the night, and never look back. But something kept her rooted there, something deep and unshakable, as if she were bound to the house, to whatever was coming for her. The kitchen light flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She could hear it now, the slow, deliberate creak of floorboards as something moved through the house, getting closer, its presence unmistakable. In the darkness, she could feel it near, watching her, waiting. Her hand found the edge of the counter, gripping it tightly as she took a step back. But just as she did, a cold gust of wind rushed through the room, and with it came a low, rasping breath. "Why did you look?" The voice was closer now, so close she could feel the chill of it against her skin. Clara's eyes darted toward the attic stairs, and for a brief moment, she saw something, just a glimpse of a figure, barely there in the darkness. It was her, but not her. The reflection she had seen in the mirror, the version of herself that had smiled that unnatural, predatory smile. It was free. Clara stumbled backward, her heart pounding, her legs weak beneath her. The figure took a step toward her, moving with a slow, deliberate grace, its eyes gleaming with something dark and malevolent. She could feel its cold gaze piercing through her, freezing her in place. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. The figure drew closer, its shadowy form flickering in and out of the dim light, and Clara knew this was her, but twisted, changed. The version of herself that had been trapped between worlds, waiting for this moment to break free. "Why did you look?" the voice whispered again, colder, sharper, as the figure stepped into the faint light spilling in from the window. It was Clara, but its face was hollow, its eyes black as coal, its smile the same unnerving grin she had seen in the attic. The air grew impossibly cold, and Clara's vision began to blur as the figure reached out, its hand extending toward her, fingers long and sharp like claws. She tried to move, to run, but the cold had seeped into her bones, freezing her in place. The figure leaned in close, its breath icy against her cheek. "You shouldn't have looked," it whispered, its voice now dark and dripping with malice. And then everything went black. When Clara woke, the world was dim, bathed in a hazy light that filtered in through the kitchen window. For a moment, she thought it was morning. The nightmare, the mirror, the figure, all of it had felt so distant, as though it belonged to another life. But as she blinked, trying to clear her head, the cold weight of reality settled over her. The kitchen was as silent as the grave. The shadows lingered in the corners, watching her as she struggled to sit up. Her body felt heavy, her limbs stiff and unresponsive. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. She pushed herself to her feet, each movement slow and deliberate, as though she were pulling herself out of quicksand. Her breath was shallow, her skin clammy with a sheen of cold sweat. Clara's eyes darted to the attic door, half expecting to see the figure descending, but the house was still, eerily so. She should leave. Run far from this place and never return. But something pulled her toward the mirror. Without thinking, Clara's feet moved of their own accord, carrying her through the dimly lit house, up the creaking stairs, and back into the attic. The door was open, the cold draft swirling out, beckoning her in. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, but the pull was irresistible. She had to know. The mirror stood in the center of the attic, its surface gleaming despite the darkness that clung to every corner of the room. It was the same mirror, yet it felt different now, larger, more imposing. It loomed before her like a silent, waiting presence. Clara took a step closer, her reflection coming into view. At first, it seemed normal. Her face stared back at her, pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. But then, as she moved closer, the reflection began to change. The edges of her face rippled, distorting like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. Her reflection smiled. Not the tight, fearful smile of someone trying to reassure themselves, but a slow, creeping grin that spread across her face like a crack splitting the surface of fragile glass. The eyes in the reflection darkened, losing their human warmth, becoming hollow and empty, like two black voids staring back at her. Clara froze, unable to tear her gaze away from the reflection. It wasn't her. Not anymore. The thing in the mirror leaned forward, pressing its hands against the glass, mimicking her movements with an eerie precision. And then, it whispered in a voice that was both hers and something else entirely. "You shouldn't have looked." Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She stumbled backward, her body trembling. But as she moved, the reflection stayed, its smile widening, the glass warping and bending as though it were no longer solid. Before she could react, the reflection reached through. Its hand emerged from the mirror, long and cold, its fingers curling around Clara's wrist with a grip like iron. She gasped, trying to pull away, but the reflection was stronger, impossibly strong. It tugged, and Clara felt herself being pulled toward the mirror, the surface of the glass rippling like water, ready to swallow her whole. "No," Clara whispered, her voice weak, as she struggled against the pull. "No." But the reflection only smiled wider, its eyes gleaming with malice as it dragged her closer. Her body felt weightless, as though the world around her had ceased to exist. She was being pulled into the mirror, into the space between worlds, where shadows ruled and time had no meaning. As her body touched the surface of the glass, a cold shock ran through her. The mirror was no longer solid, it was liquid, like ice-cold water, and she was sinking into it, her reflection pulling her down into the depths of whatever waited on the other side. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was her reflection, her other self, stepping out of the mirror, free at last. It stood there, in the attic, watching her with that twisted smile, as Clara vanished into the void. The house remained quiet after that night. The neighbors would occasionally mention the strange young woman who had lived there, but no one knew what had become of her. The house stood empty, the windows dark and lifeless, the attic sealed shut as though it had never been opened. But on certain nights, when the moon hung low in the sky and the air was thick with the weight of unseen things, some claimed they could hear whispers drifting from the old attic. And if anyone dared to venture up there, to look into the mirror that had been left behind, they might catch a glimpse of something, someone on the other side. A face. A smile. A version of themselves they'd never want to meet. Because once you look, you can never unsee. And some reflections never leave.